My name's Robert Hubbard. I work at the NASA Kennedy Space Center. So a little bit about myself. I've been with NASA for about 10 years. I've worked in various capacities since being here, mainly in project management. My most recent job, which I've been in for the last, probably about 4 years, has been business development. So my job here is to engage the public, engage potential commercial partnerships across the space industry, to come into KC and potentially partnering with us on various technologies, utilizing our current infrastructure for launch operations, as well as for any type of technical support that may be needed in order to help get a specific program or project off the ground. So what I'm going to talk to you all about today is the transformation that we've gone through here at the Kennedy Space Center. It's kind of been a long time coming, but it's in our eyes, it's definitely a great story in terms of how we've gotten to where we are and how we were able to survive, some really major challenges in terms of, how we operate, how we're structured, our dependency on programs and whatnot. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the presentation now. All right, hopefully everybody can see my charts. What you're looking at right here, this is just a visual depiction of the Kennedy Space Center. This area that you're looking at here on my cover is what we call the LC-39 complex. LC stands for Launch Complex. Over to the far left, you see our VAB, our Vehicle Assembly Building. That's the building we've been utilizing to process a lot of our rockets over the last 40-plus years. Immediately to the right of it, you see one of our launch complexes, Pad 39A. And then just a little bit north of that, you see another launch pad. And then off to the right of that, you see a few more launch pads that we have on our Air Force side where we launch a lot of our commercial rockets. And then toward the top right, you see a rocket that's actually taking off. This here, in our mind, is a very, very great depiction of where we see the future going in terms of the Kennedy Space Center, where you have multiple operations going on simultaneously in an environment where you have both government and commercial utilizing assets. The Kennedy Space Center is a very, very interesting place that most people probably haven't heard most of, unless it comes to talks about rockets and launches. But we sit on 144,000 acres. We're home to over 13,000 species of animals. We have a lot of endangered species. Now, although much of the land is being utilized by the Fish and Wildlife Services, because we do sit on a wildlife preserve, so we do want to keep this area pristine to take care of all the wildlife that is out there, that being the plants and the animals. One of the things that we are commonly known for are our alligators, which is at the top right photo. We have lots of them. On any given day, you can walk outside and see them right along the banks of the water. Again, Kennedy Space Center is a unique location because we do sit right on the coast, which allows us to operate spacecrafts or rockets in a manner that we're able to protect the general public. What we typically do when we launch due east, which allows us to go over the ocean as opposed to going over populated areas. Looking at the programs here at Kennedy Space Center over the years, we had Freedom 7, we've had Apollo, as well as the Space Shuttle program. So one of our first programs that we had here at KSC was our Freedom program, which was back in 1961, which is a photo from that launch. KSC did not come into official existence until 1962. The next photo, which you show the Apollo mission 11 in 1969, this was one of our final missions, using that platform. Now, one of the unique things about the Kennedy Space Center is the fact that we've had multiple platforms of vehicles flying from the Kennedy Space Center for nearly 50 years. So, there's a lot of things that we are very proud of, and one being the fact that we are really the workhorse of the agency, because really we are the gateway to space for NASA. Other thing I want to call to your attention is the middle photo, which is our final photo, our final shot of Atlantis STS-135 just as it's leaving the launch pad. This was our last mission of the Space Shuttle program, which ended in 2011. This was one of the biggest programs ever in the history of the space program. This program was designed in a way that they wanted to have a vehicle that was evolvable, but not just evolvable, but also reusable. And that was something that we've never had before. The plan was to have, missions that would routinely go into LEO, which is low Earth orbit, for human space flight operations. Now, that program, we were able to have 5 different space shuttles. They were the Columbia, the Challenger, the Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. Unfortunately, as most of you guys know, we did lose both the Columbia and the Challenger in 2 unfortunate catastrophic events, but I can say that we were able to continue the program after both unfortunate events, where we were able to finish out the program strong with 3 really solid vehicles, that being Discovery, Atlantis, and the Endeavour vehicles. So we have this really neat idea here that was birthed about 4 years ago, and that was that we wanted to transform the Kennedy Space Center to being a multi-user spaceport. Now, if you look back in time and you look at how we managed the Kennedy Space Center before, we had a center that was centered around the space shuttle. In other words, the space shuttle really was the driving force behind much of the Kennedy Space Center. And by that, I mean we were heavily dependent upon the program fund dollars that came into the center, because that was really what brought a lot of money into the Space Center, as well as what we used to run the center. Now, we knew early on that, because the Space Center was going to be going through this change with flying out the space shuttle, we knew that we were going to have to really change the way we were operating, going from being a very single customer oriented operation, that being the space shuttle, to being a multi-customer, multi-need spaceport. So what we did was we started putting our hands together trying to figure out, okay, how do we define who we are to become? And what we came up with is vision statement at the bottom, which says our goal at the end of the day is to be the world's preeminent launch complex for government and commercial space access. So that's, really opening the door and enabling commercial customers to accessing commercial space. But in doing so, what we really thought was important was making sure that the public and the commercial partners knew that we were opening the doors so that they can come in, utilize our facilities, our infrastructure, our technical capabilities, technologies, what have you. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as I proceed on. In 2010, we figured, hey, in order to continue to remain relevant in terms of this agency and really having, a solid position in terms of key leadership across NASA, we figured that it was important that we take a leadership role in having multiple NASA programs led and managed by the Kennedy Space Center. So of those programs, here we have 4. GSEO, which is our newest program, which focuses on ground infrastructure and ground systems, and this is in order to enable commercial space, but not just them, but also our follow-on vehicle, that being the SLS rocket, which stands for Space Launch System. The Launch Services Program, which is for our unmanned missions, or what we call our ELV rockets, Expendable Launch Vehicles. Commercial Crew, which really focuses on procuring a ride on a commercially available rocket so that our astronauts can go travel and explore LEO, whether it's, exploring just outside of the atmosphere, Earth's atmosphere, or accessing the International Space Station or a space station that is of the like. And then lastly, we have the International Space Station Ground Processing and Research Project Office. This project office is probably one of my favorites because it shows a great example of how we, NASA, has partnered with various entities around the world to create, in my mind, what I believe is one of the most fascinating and remarkable things known to man, that being the International Space Station. So as you know, we've been up and running for well over 10 years. We here at KSC have been processing payloads, research, as well as modules that have flown to station, and it's just been a very, very outstanding relationship that we've been able to maintain with commercial partners as well as international companies and countries. So GSDO, as I mentioned before, their whole idea was, we want to come in and enable commercial space, but not just that, but also continue to ensure that we have the right infrastructure in place for the SLS program. So we took a hard look at our architecture, how we're going to allow for these multiple operations to take place at KSC from an infrastructure standpoint. So one of the first projects that we took on was looking at the launch pads. So the first pad we tackled was LC39B, which is Launch Complex 39B. And a decision was made that we would go with what we refer to as a clean pad concept. Now, back in the day, when we were launching shuttles, we had infrastructure that was unique to the space shuttle. You had a lot of hardware that was there on the pad. Well, because of all of the unique hardware there, it prevented other platforms from being able to launch from that launch pad. So we decided that we would go with a clean concept where you do a plug and play, where you bring in a mobile launcher and you launch from that mobile launcher in that platform, as opposed to having a platform built in place. That way you can have the SLS program launching from there, as well as various customers. At the bottom, we're showing the mobile launcher, which is what we use to relocate the rocket as well as the launcher on top of the crawler transporter to the pad. Top right, we're looking at the SLF, which is the shuttle landing facility. Something interesting about it, it is 3 miles long. It is 150 feet on both sides of the center line, totaling out at 300 feet wide, making this one of the largest runways in the world. Next to that, you see photos of the VAB, the Vehicle Assembly Building, which is where we, for a number of years, have done all of our integration, maintenance, and checkout of our rockets, as well as the shuttle. Interesting enough, this assembly building is, by volume, one of the largest buildings in the United States. You see Communications Command and Control. This is really going in and taking a look at how we've been managing command and control over the last several years, and ensuring that we're able to continue launching rockets from KSC and managing all communication aspects here at the Kennedy Space Center, where customers can come in and utilize those resources as well. The next chart we're looking at is how we're going to be focusing our efforts with the SLS project going forward. We've approached it from 3 phases. So we have a Earth Reliant, which focuses on near distance locations, so things that are within near Earth or LEO. So you have International Space Station, you may have some other observation telescopes or spacecrafts that we may go in service, and these are things that we can get to relatively quick. The next phase will be the proving ground. This is where we will take this rocket that is very much evolvable, and we will, tackle going to space stations that are further deeper in space, and these are space stations that today don't exist. The moon, as well as asteroids, and then the last phase, again, with an evolvable vehicle, one that will take us to Mars and beyond. And this could be, again, more deep space spacecrafts, Mars, as well as asteroids for exploration purposes. This here is just a couple of photos of our SLS rocket, just to give you a visual depiction of how the rocket will be situated on the mobile launch platform. what it will look like once it reaches orbit, what it looks like inside of the vehicle assembly building. We're taking a look at the Orion crew capsule, and this photos were taken here at Kennedy Space Center, where we've been doing a substantial amount of testing for the last probably 6 or 7 years, getting the vehicle ready for flight. Now, the flight will be launching next month, and we are referring to it as EFT-1. This vehicle is going to be launching its test flight on December 4th. So this right here showed you what it looks like. The test flight will essentially launch from KSC on Slick 37B, which is one of our launch pads at the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, again, right next door to us. We share property. The plan is for it to begin its launch there. It will complete a full orbit around the Earth, and as it comes back around, it will re-enter just off the coast of California. All right, so the next program is our Launch Services Program. As I mentioned before, outstanding program. This is one that's been around for quite a few years. The idea behind this program is they don't own any rockets. Their position is strictly to serve as a launch broker. So they go out, they procure the rockets, and ensure all safety analysis, flight design, and trajectory is done properly on behalf of a particular customer. The customer could be a satellite company, the customer could be the Department of Defense, a customer could be another government agency that wants to send some type of Earth observation telescope or observatory to space. There are several launch sites around the world that we launch at for this particular program. So we have our Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is out in California, Reagan Test Site. We have Kodiak Island, which is in Alaska. We have, of course, Cape Canaveral Air Force Station here in Florida, and then we have Wallops Flight Facility, which is located in Virginia. This here is just an example of some of the different missions that have been manifested for the LSP program from 2014 through 2016. Much of these programs are various telescopes and observatory spacecrafts, some of which are owned specifically or exclusively by NASA, or is a joint partnership between NASA and some other government agency. So the next program we have is our Commercial Crew Program, CCP. The idea behind this program is we buy rides on commercial launch providers' vehicles. So the company, they provide the vehicle. We do all of the safety analysis because these, of course, are our astronauts. We want to ensure their safety. And we buy a ride from them, and that way they can go do all of the LEO exploration, whether it's going to space station or doing some observations just in the LEO environment. And that way that frees resources for NASA so that we can continue to develop our spacecraft or our launch vehicle platform, the SLS, that will take us, you know, again, to the moon, Mars, and beyond. So for more deep space exploration. Then we have the International Space Station, ground processing support. What's interesting about this piece of hardware is that every module that is flying on board the International Space Station was processed here at the Kennedy Space Center. Each piece of hardware was flown here. We did all of the testing, integration, and analysis before it was packaged and placed on board the shuttle and flown up the station. What's really nice about the International Space Station is it's an outstanding platform for various types of technology development and testing in, you know, this weightlessness environment. What I like about these photos is that it's an outstanding depiction of the different types of research that goes on there. I mean, you have human performance testing that goes on there. There's robotic testing. There's testing on lights that will look at how humans perform under certain lighting conditions, how plants perform under certain lighting conditions, as well as different other types of plant research where we're looking at, you know, what plants grow best in a weightless environment. Some really neat stuff there. what we're starting to see over the last 5 or 6 years is that spaceflight is changing. There's lots of stuff going on, and there's lots of companies that are really trying to break into the market, and we see that as a really cool and exciting thing. A lot of what we're seeing is things that are falling within the bucket of space-based research, crew training and transport, spacecraft deployment, and even spacecraft tourism. In fact, we have a couple of companies that are wanting to come to KSC and do some of those activities that I just mentioned before. So what we've been trying to do here at KSC over the last 4 years is really create this multi-user spaceport. Now, in doing so, we're talking of really, changing the culture, where again we had an environment that was centered strictly around government programs, and now what we're saying is we want an environment that really opens the door to true partnerships between government organizations, commercial entities, nonprofit groups, and it's something that we're extremely excited about and is now starting to become a norm. So a few years ago, when the management team sat down and tried to figure out, how is it that we want to proceed with this, we started looking, internally, trying to figure out what made the best sense for trying the idea of enabling commercial space. And for us, the most ideal thing was coming in and allowing partners to utilize existing resources at the Kennedy Space Center. Now, resources, as I mentioned before, could span across technical capabilities, infrastructure. We have some really successful partnerships that I'm going to mention shortly, where partners have come in and were able to utilize these different resources to grow the business and really help their companies get off the ground. So in terms of building this spaceport, we have been working on this idea of what we call a central campus, where we're trying to make this feel more as an industrial park, if you will, more so like a college campus, if you will, with the more industrial parts on the outer skirts. So we've been making a lot of updates to our launch pads. That's making changes to the cooling systems. The heating and cooling chambers have been replaced. We've been changing out a lot of our comms, our fiber. It's a work in progress, but I can say that a lot of great things are happening out there, because a lot of this infrastructure has been around for many, many years. And the great thing about this is, we're saving money for the customer, not just for the government, but also for the customer, because now the customer doesn't have to come in and spend lots of money recreating these facilities, these launch pads, in order to enable themselves. So it essentially becomes a win-win for everybody. So in terms of transitioning to this multi-user spaceport, we have a lot of success stories that I'm extremely proud of. So for example, we have partnerships that have included many of our key facilities that, again, were there supporting the space shuttle program. So, for example, we have our OPF, our Orbital Processing Facility, Bay 3, which we are working with Space Florida, which is an economic development group, and the Boeing Corporation for utilizing access for their CST-100 crew capsule. NSLD, Craig Technologies for advanced manufacturing, our shuttle landing facility, partnering with Space Florida, again, the economic development group, where we're bringing in customers from all over the United States that want to have access to the runway where they can do horizontal launch operations. Really great stuff. And then we have Pad A, which in this past spring we turned over to SpaceX to come in and launch their Falcon 9 Heavy from. So in the next few months, there's going to be a couple of announcements on the streets, RFIs, where we're going to be making available our mobile launch platform, our vehicle assembly building, High Bay 1, to partners to potentially come in and utilize. So KSC of the future, I think this picture right here really depicts what it is that we see KSC looking like in the future, where you have multiple operations going on at Kennedy Space Center simultaneously. Back in the day, you had strictly government operations taking place at KSC. And the way we see the future is you have, just like in the top left corner, you have the X-Core vehicle flying off from the SLF, Shuttle Landing Facility. Right beneath it, you have the straddle launch vehicle flying. On the ground, the vehicle that is sitting there is an example of one of our partners with Sierra Nevada. That's the Dream Chaser. The two crew capsules, you have the CST-100 as well as the Orion crew capsule. And the launch vehicles that you see there, again, good representation, government and commercial use. You got SpaceX, you have the SLS rocket, which is on the far right. You have Ares rockets, and then, of course, at the top we have moons, Mars, and we also have examples of some of the asteroids that we're looking to potentially go and explore as being the next phase of the NASA program. NASA for the last 5 or 6 years have been really trying to firm up what the next steps are for human exploration. So we have, again, like I had mentioned before, we're trying to approach this in a phased way. So really trying to look at how do we best utilize the resources that we have today. Now, in order to capitalize on those resources, specifically money and technology, we have to, start from a point where we have technology that is evolvable, which is why we are approaching this tiered manner, if you will, where the first step is International Space Station, which we have conquered that. So now we want to start pushing those boundaries and going into deep space operations. So that's moving large objects, whether it's space debris or landing on asteroids and relocating those. Really, that's what our focus is on the near term. Now, beyond that, the next goal is Mars. We really want to focus our efforts on trying to get to Mars, because really we think that that's where we're going to get the best bang for our buck. It's the closest planet to ours that has an environment that would more than likely be able to sustain life. And that's what we're trying to understand more about the planet Mars. Now, beyond Mars is where the moon comes in. Now, I cannot assign a time frame as to when we're going to, make our way back to the moon. But I mean, the overarching idea is, hey, we've already been to the moon. We've landed there. We've done some exploration there. But we think that our focus really for this next phase should be on Mars. How do we ensure survivability if, for whatever reason, we have to leave the home planet? The Kennedy Space Center sits on a wildlife refuge, and much of the refuge has water. So we have natural waterways. Some of them are ponds, some of them are streams, some of them are runoffs of the ocean. The primary reason for it is it's in its natural habitat. The water has always been there. It's mainly a wetland is what we sit on. Because it is a refuge, a wildlife refuge, one of the things that we have been tasked with doing is ensuring that the Space Center stays in its most natural habitat. So we have specific areas that we can develop on. So the area that you're looking at is, again, that water has been there for a number of years. So the plan is around the SLF on both the east and the west side of the runway, we will narrow those streams and build out on those areas. We will have piping that will allow the water to continue to flow. But for the most part, again, the idea is to keep it in its natural state. The alligators, we have lots of alligators. It's very common to see alligators around the center. A lot of them kind of stay along the banks, along the waterways here. So it's very common for you to see alligators at any point, throughout the day. In fact, there's a ditch just outside of my building where we pass every day to the parking lot, and there's a little baby alligator that's probably about 3 feet long that kind of hangs out in the ditch. We typically don't bother the alligators. Again, our job here is to ensure the safety of not only, the people here at the Kennedy Space Center, but also we want to protect the animals because we are, environmentally conscious. So the only time we really have to go in and deal with the alligators is if we see that they're posing a risk to humans, to space operations, or to themselves. Thank you.